"Hi, Mom, did you find a job?" Billy asked from the doorway. Naomi looked into her son's eyes and shook her head. "That's great, Mommy. It means that you can stay with us like before," her daughter Sally exclaimed joyfully. At that moment, the woman's heart melted. "What would I do without you?" Naomi said with a smile and hugged her children. Billy had recently turned 9 years old, but his sister Sally was only 7. Kiddos have always been the meaning of her life for Naomi, especially after the death of her husband when she was left all alone with them. Naomi had always considered herself a strong woman who wasn't afraid of any hardships. A difficult childhood caused by the early demise of her parents and years spent in an orphanage could harden anyone's character, and Naomi was no exception. Fate didn't spare the orphan, immersing herself in the real world with all of its difficulties. When Naomi reached the age of majority and left the orphanage, she immediately started college, hoping to fulfill her dream of becoming a translator. The caregivers always noted the girl's predisposition towards studying languages, which seemed to come naturally to her. Studying wasn't easy for Naomi at first, but the situation had changed dramatically by her junior year, and the young woman's grades improved significantly. It was at this turning point that she met Richard, who was studying at the Department of Economics and Management. The handsome young man immediately turned the head of the naive young woman, who believed in romantic ideals and loved reading books about love. Richard was the captain of the football team at the time and thus had many admirers. Their relationship developed so quickly that even the couple themselves seemed to be surprised by it. Naomi felt like she'd found her soulmate, someone who could be the first and only man in her life. It just so happened that having gotten pregnant, Naomi had to take a leave of absence from school. The young woman sincerely hoped that she'd be able to resume her studies after giving birth to the baby. The couple got married quickly since they couldn't really postpone the wedding, given the bride's pregnancy. Little Billy was born 6 months later and immediately became the center of the couple's attention. The happiness of motherhood overwhelmed Naomi, making her forget all about her studies, at least for a while. Of course, it was a big mistake, but it would take the young woman a couple of years to realize that. 2 years later, Sally was born. Now the little girl became the center of everyone's attention, having taken the spotlight off Billy. Like any naive woman living in her own world, Naomi felt like her family happiness wasn't all that hard to achieve. Richard worked as a sales manager and his wife stayed home raising their children. Always being very supportive of her husband, Naomi tried not to burden him with any household chores. The woman cooked all the food, kept the house clean, and even took care of the lawn in front of the house. Unfortunately, the perfect life didn't last long, and Richard soon lost interest in his wife. Even though his attitude towards his family didn't really change, Naomi couldn't help but worry about the fact that he started staying late at work more and more often. Nevertheless, the woman tried to convince herself that Richard couldn't be having an affair. Meanwhile, the husband continued to behave rather strangely. He explained his late nights at the office, citing a heavy workload and the fact that the management had given him a lot of new responsibilities. "But honey, that's not okay. You need to take care of yourself. The kiddos will grow up a little and I'll find a job too," Naomi used to say. But Richard only smiled at his wife, hinting at the fact that she never actually finished college. It took Naomi some time to finally realize that her husband was cheating on her after all. At first, she tried hard to ignore the lipstick stains on her husband's shirts, as well as the smell of woman's perfume coming from his clothes. But there came a point when she simply couldn't pretend anymore and had to accept the fact that her husband was having an affair. It took Naomi a couple of days to think the situation through and finally decide what she wanted to do next. When she decided to have a talk with her husband, something very unexpected happened. Richard went over the speed limit on his way home from work and rammed the guardrails, after which his car fell off the bridge and into a river. The rescuers arrived at the scene of the accident and combed the bottom of the river, but they never managed to find Richard's body. "The current is very strong here, ma'am. His body could have been carried away far beyond the state lines," one of the rescuers said. Since Richard's personal belongings were found inside the sunken car, no one had any doubt about whether the man had died in the accident. After everything that happened, Naomi started doubting whether Richard was actually having an affair. Sometimes it takes the death of the loved one to make a person realize that they could forgive anything. Left alone with her problems and 2 young children in her care, Naomi realized that it was time for her to step up. Even though she never managed to finish college, the woman still tried to find a job as a translator. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy to do as Naomi had hoped it would be. Going from one office to another, the woman heard the same thing over and over again. We don't hire people with no work experience. At some point, Naomi got so desperate that she decided to take the job of a cleaner in a trading company. Only then did the woman realize what a huge mistake it was to quit college. But it was too late to think about it, and Naomi understood it like no one else. Since the building of the trading company was large, Naomi always had a lot of work. Her job was especially hard on rainy days, since the staff brought in a lot of dirt from the outside. But Naomi didn't lose heart and kept the floors perfectly clean, mopping them virtually non-stop. This definitely wasn't her dream job, but the woman really didn't have any other options. Having kiddos who needed food and clothes was an important enough reason to make concessions and take whatever job she could find. It's hard to say how Naomi's life would have developed if, one day, she hadn't noticed a sheet of paper on the director's desk. It was a document written in Spanish. Since the office was empty, Naomi plucked up the courage and picked up the sheet of paper. Inadvertently, she translated the text in her head, mechanically noting the mistakes of its author. Moving her lips, the young cleaning lady quietly read out the text, translating it seamlessly. At that point, the director came into the office and froze in amazement. "Naomi, do you speak Spanish?" Albert Parker exclaimed in surprise. Naomi shuddered and blushed to the very roots of her hair. The woman was ashamed of the fact that she took the document from the director's desk. "Yes, sir, I actually do. I once studied to be a translator." Naomi's answer made Albert raise an eyebrow in surprise and ask her, "So, are you a certified translator?" Naomi was embarrassed to admit that she wasn't and lowered her eyes. It took the woman a moment to pull herself together and tell the director that she quit her studies during junior year. Having heard the woman's story, Albert thought for a moment. The thing was that one of his partners was looking for a translator from Spanish and Portuguese. Since the languages were similar, Albert was confident that Naomi could handle the job. In the depths of his soul, he felt sorry for the young woman, who was forced to work as a cleaner all the while having such skills. "Look, Naomi, how do you feel about working as a translator?" the director asked. The director's proposal put Naomi in an awkward position. On the one hand, she was ready to drop the mop and immediately get to work as a translator. But on the other hand, Naomi understood that her knowledge might not be sufficient to perform this job. Moreover, it wasn't Albert who needed the translator, but one of his business partners, who might not be as kind as this young man was. Seeing doubt written all over Naomi's face, Albert tried to convince her that she could definitely handle the job. "I read your file. You have 2 kids and you're raising them on your own. You won't be able to provide a decent life for them working as a cleaner. But if you succeed in your new job, your salary would increase several times," the director said with an emphasis on the last words. Perhaps it was Albert's support that helped Naomi make the right decision. The young woman would have probably never risen to the challenge on her own and would have most likely worked as a cleaner for the rest of her life. However, there was another reason that kept the young woman from accepting the director's offer right away. The woman simply didn't have any business clothes, which she would need if she were to take the job of a translator. As a cleaner, Naomi could simply show up to work in jeans and a hoodie. The company dress code didn't apply to the cleaning staff, which was definitely to the young woman's advantage. But if Naomi were to work at the office, she would need a business suit, new shoes, and many other items she'd never had. It's hard to say whether the director read the woman's mind somehow or simply made an educated guess, but it was Albert who found a solution to Naomi's problem. "I think I can help you. I'll be waiting for you outside after work. We'll go to a very interesting place." "What place?" Naomi exclaimed in surprise. "Oh, don't worry. I simply meant a clothing store. We'll need to get you some new clothes so you could look your best for the interview," Albert answered with a smile. He liked this woman more and more with each passing second. She was very natural and uninhibited, and it was very refreshing. As promised, Albert took Naomi shopping after work. The man told Naomi that she could get whatever she wanted, and then simply sat in an armchair and observed the situation. Naomi was very anxious. She could never afford this kind of clothing, even back when Richard was still alive. Trying on all kinds of outfits, Naomi winced every time she saw the price tag. If she could, she would have bought half the store and made sure that she had enough amazing clothes to last her a lifetime. Understanding the excitement of his companion, Albert gently but professionally gave Naomi a couple of tips. Soon, the young cleaning lady stopped at 2 business suits in black and olive colors, as well as a pair of shoes to match the clothes. "There you go, that's so much better," Albert said and paid for the purchase. Then he opened the door of his car for Naomi and volunteered to take her home. On their way, the young people started talking and realized that they really liked each other. To his surprise, Albert saw that Naomi was so much more than just a cleaner. She was a smart and sweet woman with a wonderful sense of humor. Few people knew that Albert was very unhappy in his personal life, and that he used to be married but got a divorce because his wife had cheated on him with his best friend. Albert Parker had always dreamed of having children, which he believed were the true meaning of life. Unfortunately, his ex-wife had a different take on the matter and wanted to live for herself, disregarding the wants and needs of her husband. Albert knew that Naomi was raising 2 kiddos, and that fact actually made him very happy. Halfway to Naomi's house, the man stopped at a bakery where he bought treats for the kids. "I hope your kids like these," Albert said, handing the woman a bag full of pastries. Feeling a bit awkward, Naomi tried to invite the director over for dinner, but as any well-mannered man would do in that situation, he politely refused. Albert felt a bit uncomfortable that the entire evening seemed a bit like a first date, which in fact, it wasn't. But as we all know, people tend to make mistakes, regardless of their age. Trying to tell himself that there was nothing going on between him and Naomi, Albert actually fell head over heels for her. The next day, the businessman came up with some rather far-fetched reason to pay Naomi a visit. Of course, the woman could feel that there was something the director wasn't telling her. She knew that he didn't just come over to talk about work. That day, Albert played ball with Billy and Sally out in the yard until he was simply exhausted. Noting how happy her kiddos were, Naomi caught herself thinking that she was liking this confident man more and more with each passing second. Naomi considered herself to be a virtuous woman, and therefore she didn't rush things and was afraid to admit that she'd fallen in love even to herself. If Naomi and Albert had more time, they would probably have eventually professed their feelings for each other. But since they were supposed to see Albert's partner the next day, the romantic component of their relationship had to be pushed into the background. As it turned out, the director of the company was going to introduce Naomi to a certain Nicholas Brown, who came from a neighboring state and intended to start a business in their city. His business was mostly based on trading with the countries of Western Europe, Spain and Portugal in particular. Feeling a bit anxious, Naomi carefully opened the door and stepped into Nicholas's office. The man was immersed in some documents and didn't raise his head right away. But when the businessman finally did decide to greet the woman, something very unexpected happened. Imagine Naomi's surprise when she saw that Nicholas Brown was actually her dead husband, Richard. The silence lasted several minutes, and Naomi was the first one to break it. "So, where have you been hiding all this time? And why did you have to lie? Why did you want to hurt your kids like that? Making them think that you were dead?" Richard turned pale and grabbed his tie, intending to loosen it. At that moment, his entire past life flashed before him, including the scam he ran. The reason for Richard's flight was his mistress, who grew up in a very wealthy family. Her parents promised Richard to help him start his own business, provided that he would marry their daughter. It's hard to say why Richard couldn't have simply divorced Naomi. Most likely, the devious man was simply afraid of the legal ramifications, that is, of the divisions of assets and having to pay alimony. Instead, Richard came up with a solution that seemed much simpler to him and faked his own death. He spent several years hiding out in a neighboring state, where he did business and lived under a false name. However, as we all know, nothing stays secret forever. For some reason, Richard decided that he was invincible and started doing business in his home state, where he met Albert Parker, who inevitably brought Naomi to his office. The poor woman was too intelligent to cause a scene or start sorting things out right there and then. Naomi simply slammed the door and left the office of her low-life husband. On their way back, she told Albert about everything that happened to her and advised the businessman against working with Richard ever again. Only then did Albert realize what a dangerous man fate had brought into his life. After all, no one knows what could have happened to his company if he continued doing business with Richard. Thus, thanks to Naomi, Albert avoided any potential losses and got to keep his good name. But that wasn't even the most important thing. The main win was that the man finally managed to figure out his feelings. Albert was having a hard time admitting to the fact that he was having feelings for Naomi, but now he decided to speak about them openly. Naomi chose not to get revenge on her cheating husband and simply decided to live her life if he really was dead. The woman was starting a new relationship with Albert Parker, who had already proposed to her. Richard, on the other hand, punished himself by trying to run another scam, which cost him a sentence of several years in prison. During this time, his new wife left him and made sure that he'd never get a cent of her money. Having married Albert, Naomi gave birth to 2 more children. Looking at the heroes of our story today, there's no doubt that they will rise up to all of life's challenges and carry their love for each other through many, many years.